impulses.
It seems to me, Jordan, that your position is fundamentally a positive one. It's an affirmation of human dignity, the freedom that dignity demands, and an affirmation of the infinite particularity of human life. If one were to contrast the collectivist thinking, on the one hand, if one might call it a kind of abstract rationality, as if there's one solution to fit them, one size fits all, kind of top-down logic. What's on the other side? What's the antidote to that in the individual?
Yeah, it is particularity. I mean, one of the things I talk about in 12 Rules for Life, and in my lectures, this has become a meme, strangely enough, something that's widely distributed on the web, partly because there's a comical element to it. It's to clean up your room. And everyone laughs about that because I'm taking that seriously. It's like, well, clean up your room. Everyone's mother has told them that 1,000 times, right? But I try to explain why. It's like, well, you have a bit of chaotic potential right in front of you. It's, in some sense, infinite in its potential. And the domain in which you can manipulate that might be rather restricted because of the restrictions that are part and parcel of your existence. But maybe you have your room, and you might have contempt for that, and so it's a complete bloody catastrophe. But you don't have to. You could think, well, I've got a little... It isn't a room, it's a place of potential. And as soon as you know that, then it's not your room anymore. It isn't a room. The room that you see is your preconception of the space that you inhabit. What's there is a fragment of infinity. That's what's there. And what you see is the low resolution consequence of your assumption and lazy habit and blindness. That's your initial room. And you think, well, no, that's not the room. See, part of what artists do, for example, when Van Gogh paints a room and you look at it glowing, he's trying to show you what's beyond your perception of the room. And I mean this technically, like the way that your visual system is set up is that whenever memory and presumption can replace direct perception, it will, because it's simpler. So you literally see what you expect to see. And if what you see is dull and drab and boring and pointless and uninspiring, then that's you. It's not what's there. And what the artist does when he or she re-represents that mundane reality is to remind you of what's behind it, the potential that's there. And so what I'm suggesting to people is that they take the potential that's right in front of them. It's like, okay, and here's the rule. You're aiming up. There's something that you could change, that you would change. That might be a very small thing. Could, well, that's within the grasp of your power. Would is within the grasp of your will. To combine those two things might be a very small shift. You might only be willing to make a very tiny step forward. It's like, fine, good enough. Make a tiny step forward. And that makes you a slight bit stronger than you were before. And then the next step can be slightly larger. And it's the path of humility. It's what people act out. So there's this cathedral. It's not a cathedral. It's an oratorio in Montreal. I think it's the second largest one in the world. It's set on a hill, at the top of a hill. And there's a huge staircase leading up to it from the bottom of the hill. And people often who are crippled and who are on crutches and so forth, or in wheelchairs, go there and make their way painfully up the hill. Or maybe they do that on their knees. And the idea is that they're struggling incrementally uphill, step by step, despite their burdens, to reach the city of God on the hill. And they're acting out. That's life. It's like the proper aim is the city of God on the hill. And what is that? Well, that's that place that we talked about already, where these levels of responsibility are stacked together harmoniously, so that you're acting in your best interest, and in your family's best interest, and in the world's best interest, and I would say in the best interests of reality itself, right? Assuming that we have some integral role to play in reality, which is certainly at least true at the human level. That's the city of God on the hill that beckons to everyone. And you move up that, you move towards that humbly. So that's one step at a time. And you do it despite your burden and your suffering. All of that. And that's all dramatized in that. And it's a perfect drama of that.
And would you even say it's not simply despite your suffering, It's in and through your particular suffering. I mean, one thing that strikes me about clean up your room. Clean up your room.
Yes.
The affirmation of the particularity of your life. I mean, one thing that strikes me about deepest in our human experience is that it is infinitely particular. I mean, that you mentioned your granddaughter. I mean, the loves, the people, the experiences, the places that we're shaped by. They're not places in the abstract. This top-down sense as if there could be the same kinds of clothes and the same kinds of experience for all human beings. That's the enemy of the very deepest truth of our human experience, which it seems to me is infinitely particular, but not infinitely particular in the sense in which those particularities just go all off into nothingness. Those particulars are precisely our points of access to the transcendent, to the infinite, to that which
that's where the reality is.
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
yes.
so that's why Jung said that modern men can't see God because they don't look low enough.
Yes.
They're not paying attention to the importance of the particularities, because
Yes.
the particularity is where the pen meets the paper, right?
Yes.
And it's just a tiny dot every like when you're writing, it's a dot, and then it extends into a line, and those transform into words and sentences and paragraphs. But the particular act is where the pen meets the paper.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's that focal point, right?
Yes.
That's the center of the cross,
Yes.
by the way. It's
Yes.
the same
Yes.
thing.
Yes. Well, you mentioned the cross. I mean, certainly in the history of the West, one of the ways this comes through is, and in the East too, is in Christian theology, is the very notion of the incarnation. What is that to say? But that the infinite is in the particular, and that they are co-inherent. That the infinite, in fact, has no life except in the particular, and the particular itself has a relation to or is comprehended by that very infinite. And so it seems to me that what is going on there is an affirmation that every particularity, no matter how tiny, itself is revelatory of a transcendent and deep reality.
I think it was from the Gospel of Thomas, but I might have this wrong. The kingdom of God is spread upon the earth, but men do not see it. And that's that infinite possibility in each moment of particularity. And that is what great artists are reminding us of. They'll take a slice of space and time. Was it Monet who painted the haystacks? He went out into the fields in France and he painted the same haystack like many, many times under different conditions of lighting, to show how different it.
Yes.
Like if it's a haystack, it's the same thing.
Yes.
But it wasn't. He paid attention to the particularities. And so what great artists are trying to do is, well, first of all, so imagine a painting. So it's a painting of a landscape. And so the first thing is that it's layers of time, because the painter has gone out there and seen the landscape and then seen it again and then seen it again and then seen it again and then seen it again, and has to pay attention to the particularities of the light and the color and all of that to represent it properly. So it's and the mere fact that he's done that is it's the acting out of the idea that in this tiny slice of time and space there's something worth attending to for an infinite amount of time. But you can't, because you just can't do it. But you need to know that you could do it and that it would be worthwhile. And so the painter encapsulates the landscape and then frames it and says, like, look through this window at the transcendent that's behind the low resolution representation of your assumption, the blindness that the expedient blindness that you by necessity bring to bear to every situation. Remember what's behind this. Always remember what's behind this. And that's what art calls us to do. That's what beauty calls us to do, is to make contact with that. And then you say, well, the problem with the particularity is that it brings suffering. And the bringing of suffering with particularity can also allow evil to enter the world, because that particular suffering can engender bitterness and resentment and hatred and all of those things, and the desire to destroy. So the particularity carries with it a tremendous risk and a tremendous burden. And so the question is, well, how do you tolerate the particularity and take advantage of the potential? And the answer is to make a relationship with the infinite that's behind the particularity. And that's the fundamental religious idea, is to, if you can maintain the particularity but also stay in contact with what's transcendent and infinite beyond that, then then you have the potential strength to tolerate the catastrophe of
Yes.
what's limited.
Yes.
And then you get to have your cake and eat it too,
Yes.
in principle.
Yes.